Blood froze on shattered window panes as bitter winter winds howled through rotting pine timber. Sterling Montgomery, an untouchable cattle baron holding deeds to half of Colorado territory, stared down a rusted Winchester rifle's barrel. A starving, desperate woman held her ground. What happened next ripped an entire frontier completely apart. Sterling Montgomery was not a man known for his charity. In the unforgiven frontier of 1887 Colorado, kindness was a vulnerability that usually got a man killed. Sterling had built the massive Ironwood Ranch with calloused hands, a cold heart, and an uncanny ability to outmaneuver both outlaws and corrupt politicians. He owned over 200,000 acres of prime grazing land, endless herds of cattle, and the loyalty of the fiercest ranch hands in the territory. Townsfolk in nearby Ridgeville whispered his name with a mixture of reverence and terror. He was wealth personified, dressed in custom-tailored broadcloth coats, riding a purebred black stallion named Midnight, and wearing a Colt .45 with grips carved from polished bone. Late November had brought an early, brutal frost to the high country. The sky was the color of bruised iron, promising a blizzard that would bury the landscape in feet of snow. Sterling was riding alone along the jagged northern perimeter of his property, a desolate stretch of rocky foothills known as Dead Man's Draw. It was an area he rarely visited, comprised mostly of dead pines and steep, impassable ravines. As Midnight picked his way through the freezing mud and ice, the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke caught Sterling's attention. He pulled back on the reins, his steely gray eyes scanning the tree line. No one had permission to be on this land. Squatters and rustlers were usually dealt with swiftly and violently by his foreman. But out here, miles from the main ranch, someone had slipped through. Sterling dismounted, his boots crunching loudly against the frosted earth. He unholstered his Colt, holding it steady by his side as he followed the wisps of smoke. Tucked away behind an overgrown thicket of dead blackberry bushes sat a ruined line shack. It was a structure built decades ago by forgotten fur trappers, its roof sagging dangerously under the weight of accumulated ice, the log walls rotten from years of neglect. The door was hanging by a single, rusted leather hinge. Sterling stepped up to the porch, the rotten wood groaning under his weight. He nudged the door open with the barrel of his revolver. "Take another step, cowboy, and I'll put a hole straight through your black heart." The voice was hoarse, raw from the cold, but it carried a deadly conviction. Sterling froze. His eyes adjusted to the dim, smoky interior. Huddled in the corner, wrapped in a filthy, moth-eaten wool blanket, was a woman. She was shivering violently, her face smudged with soot and dirt, her lips a pale, dangerous shade of blue. But it was her eyes that made Sterling hesitate. They were a piercing, defiant shade of hazel, burning with the kind of fierce desperation only found in a cornered wild animal. In her trembling hands, she leveled a rusted Winchester repeater squarely at his chest. "I reckon that rifle hasn't been oiled since the war," Sterling said, his voice a low, calm gravel. He didn't raise his hands, nor did he back away. "You pull that trigger, it's just as likely to explode in your face as it is to shoot me." "I'm willing to take that gamble," she replied, her knuckles turning white around the stock. "Get out." Sterling studied her. She was starving. He could see the hollows of her cheeks and the frail thinness of her wrists. There was no horse outside, no wagon, no provisions save for a half-empty tin of beans near a pathetic, smoldering pile of wet twigs. She was living in a death trap. "You're trespassing on Ironwood land," Sterling said, slowly lowering his revolver and sliding it back into its holster, a calculated show of peace. "I'm Sterling Montgomery. I own everything you can see from that broken window, including the dirt you're sitting on." The woman didn't flinch at his name, which surprised him. Everyone in the territory knew of Montgomery. "Then you have plenty of dirt to spare. Leave me be. I ain't causing no trouble." "You're freezing to death," he stated matter-of-factly. "A storm is cresting the ridge. By midnight, there will be 3 feet of snow outside that door. This cabin will collapse, and you will die." "My dying is my own business," she spat back, though a violent shiver racked her small frame, betraying her tough facade. Sterling stood in silence for a long moment. Logic dictated he should turn around, ride back to his warm estate, and let the harsh western winter solve his squatter problem. That was the Montgomery way. But as he looked at this woman, so utterly broken yet refusing to bow, something strange shifted in his chest. It wasn't pity. Sterling despised pity. It was profound respect. Without saying a word, Sterling turned his back on her and walked out to his horse. He unbuckled his heavy leather saddlebags, grabbed a thick, fur-lined bedroll, and carried them back inside. He dropped them unceremoniously on the dirt floor. "There's dried venison, hardtack, a canteen of fresh water, and a bottle of rye whiskey in those bags," Sterling said, ignoring the rifle that was still pointed at him. "The bedroll is heavy buffalo hide. It might keep you alive through the night." The woman stared at him, bewildered. The aggression in her eyes flickered, replaced briefly by utter confusion. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" "Right now? I want you to survive the night so I don't have to send my men to dig a grave in frozen ground," Sterling said, tipping his Stetson. "I'll be back tomorrow." As he rode away, the wind howling around him, Sterling couldn't shake the image of her haunting hazel eyes. Who was she? Why was a woman hiding out in a ruined cabin, preferring to freeze to death rather than seek help in town? The wealthy cattle baron, a man who dealt strictly in facts and profits, suddenly found himself entangled in a dangerous mystery. The blizzard hit with apocalyptic fury. For 3 days, Ridgeville and the surrounding territories were completely cut off. Inside the sprawling, luxurious parlor of the Ironwood estate, Sterling Montgomery paced like a caged panther. He stood before the roaring stone fireplace, staring into the flames, but all he could see was the ruined shack at Dead Man's Draw. By the dawn of the 4th day, the storm broke, leaving behind a blindingly white, frozen world. Before his foreman had even cleared the stable doors, Sterling was saddling Midnight. He packed a medical kit, hot broth in a thermal flask, and a spare winter coat. The ride to the northern boundary was treacherous, the snowdrifts reaching his stallion's chest. When Sterling finally reached the thicket, his heart sank. The roof of the line shack had caved in under the weight of the snow, just as he had predicted. "Hey!" Sterling shouted, his voice tearing through the silent, frozen air. He leapt from his horse, pulling logs and debris away with his bare hands, uncaring as the splinters tore through his leather gloves and drew blood. He found her pinned beneath a fallen support beam, cocooned inside the buffalo hide he had given her. She was unconscious, her skin burning with a raging fever despite the freezing temperatures. The provisions he had left were entirely gone. She had fought to stay alive until the very end. "Damn it!" Sterling cursed softly. He easily lifted the heavy beam, scooped her fragile body into his arms, and wrapped her securely against his chest. He mounted Midnight and rode like hell for the Ironwood estate. For a week, the woman hovered between life and death in a lavish guest bedroom at the ranch. Sterling hired the best physician from Denver, paying an exorbitant sum in gold to have the doctor brave the snowy passes. Sterling himself barely slept, sitting in a leather armchair beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. His ranch hands whispered among themselves. Sterling Montgomery, the ruthless baron of Blackwood County, had turned his home into a hospital for a ragged squatter. On the 8th day, her hazel eyes fluttered open. She stared at the silk curtains, the mahogany furniture, and finally at the imposing figure of Sterling, who was reading a ledger by the window. "You're awake," he said quietly, closing the book. She bolted upright, wincing in pain as her bruised ribs protested. "Where am I? My rifle." "You're at Ironwood. You're safe. Your rifle is downstairs in my armory," Sterling replied, walking over and pouring a glass of water from a crystal pitcher. He handed it to her. "Drink. The doctor said your fever broke last night." She took the glass with trembling hands, eyeing him suspiciously before taking a frantic sip. "You should have let me die in the snow, Montgomery." "I don't make a habit of letting people die on my land. It's bad for property values," he said dryly. "Now, I saved your life. I figure that buys me a name." She stared at the glass, her defensive walls cracking just a fraction. "Abigail Prescott." Sterling's brow furrowed. The name Prescott sounded vaguely familiar. Before he could press her further, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Sterling's head foreman, a grizzled man named Wyatt, knocked sharply and entered. "Boss, apologies for interrupting," Wyatt said, casting a weary glance at Abigail. "But you got trouble downstairs. Josiah Higgins just rode up with 4 of his deputies. He's demanding an audience." Abigail gasped, the crystal glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. Pure, unadulterated terror washed over her face. "No," she whispered, pulling the velvet quilt up to her chin. "He found me. Oh, God, he found me." Sterling's eyes narrowed. Josiah Higgins was a notoriously corrupt land baron from the neighboring county, a man who bought judges and intimidated homesteaders to expand his mining operations. "Wyatt, stall him in the parlor," Sterling ordered, his voice cold as ice. He turned back to Abigail, stepping closer to the bed. "Why is Josiah Higgins looking for you, Abigail?" Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. The tough exterior broke, revealing a terrified woman running for her life. "My father was Caleb Prescott. He owned a small silver claim down in Red Creek. 2 months ago, he struck a massive vein. The next night, Higgins' men raided our homestead. They murdered my father in cold blood to take the claim." Sterling's jaw tightened. "If they have the claim, why are they hunting you?" "Because they don't have the deed," Abigail said, reaching into her dirty undergarments and pulling out a folded, blood-stained piece of parchment. "My father hid this with me and told me to run. Without the original, notarized deed, Higgins can't legally sell the ore to the federal mint. He's been hunting me like a dog to get it back, framing me for my father's murder in his county." Sterling stared at the bloody parchment. The pieces fell into place. The ruined cabin, the starving woman, the Winchester rifle. She was a walking fortune, and a dead woman if Higgins got his hands on her. "Stay here. Keep the door locked," Sterling commanded. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, ensuring the bone grip of his Colt .45 was clearly visible, and strode down the grand staircase. Josiah Higgins was standing in the parlor, tracking mud onto the expensive Persian rugs. He was a large, sweaty man with a cruel smile. "Montgomery, good of you to finally come down. I'll make this quick. We tracked a fugitive onto your lands, a woman, a murderer, and a thief. I have a warrant to search your premises." Sterling stopped at the bottom of the stairs, towering over Higgins. "You have no jurisdiction in Blackwood County, Josiah, and you certainly don't have the right to search my home." "Don't play games, Sterling. My trackers found her footprints leading from that ruined line shack straight to your stables. Hand over the Prescott girl." Higgins sneered, his hand resting menacingly on his gun belt. Sterling didn't blink. His mind raced. He could kill Higgins right here, but the man had deputies, and a shootout would endanger Abigail and his staff. He could hand her over, but the thought of Abigail being dragged away to hang made his blood boil in a way he hadn't felt in years. He needed a permanent, legal wall between Abigail and this corrupt bastard. A shocking, reckless plan formed in the cattle baron's mind. "You're mistaken, Josiah," Sterling said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "There is no fugitive named Abigail Prescott residing at Ironwood." Higgins stepped forward, his face turning red. "Are you calling me a liar? I know she's up there." "I'm telling you a legal fact," Sterling replied, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "The only woman upstairs resting in my guest room is my newlywed wife, Mrs. Abigail Montgomery, and if you or your deputies take one more step toward my wife, I will consider it an act of war, and I will bury every single one of you on this ranch." Higgins froze, the blood draining from his face. The deputies behind him nervously took a step back. Everyone in the territory knew that taking on Sterling Montgomery's wealth and private army was a death sentence. "You're bluffing," Higgins stammered, though doubt laced his tone. "Would you like to test that theory?" Sterling challenged, his hand resting lightly on his Colt. "Get off my property, Josiah, and if I ever see you within 10 miles of my wife again, I won't bother asking questions." Seething with rage but entirely outmatched, Higgins spat on the floor and signaled his men to leave. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, Sterling let out a slow breath. He had just declared war on a corrupt mining baron and lied about a marriage to a woman he barely knew. He walked back upstairs and unlocked the bedroom door. Abigail was standing by the window, clutching an iron fire poker. "He's gone," Sterling said, closing the door behind him. "But he will be back. Once he checks the county records and sees there is no marriage certificate, he will return with a federal marshal." "Marriage certificate?" Abigail asked, utterly bewildered. "What did you tell him?" Sterling looked the ragged, beautiful woman squarely in the eyes. "I told him you were my wife. Under territorial law, a wife's assets and legal standing fall under the protection of her husband. As Abigail Prescott, you are a hunted fugitive. As Abigail Montgomery, you are untouchable." She dropped the poker, staring at him as if he had lost his mind. You want to marry me? A squatter? A woman with a bounty on her head?" "I don't want to. I have to, if you want to keep breathing and keep your father's mine," Sterling said, his businesslike demeanor returning. "I've already sent Wyatt to fetch Judge Harrison from Ridgeville. He's on my payroll. He'll backdate the certificate, no questions asked." Abigail shook her head, overwhelmed. "Why are you going to such lengths for a stranger, Sterling? What is the catch?" Sterling walked to the window, looking out at the vast, snow-covered empire he had built alone. He had everything a man could want. Yet, staring into Abigail's defiant eyes, he realized his massive house had felt like a tomb for years. "The catch, Abigail, is that once we sign those papers, we are entering a war. Higgins won't stop easily," Sterling said, turning back to her. "Are you brave enough to be a Montgomery?" Judge Harrison arrived at Ironwood Ranch past midnight, his whiskers crusted with frost and his temper foul. But the heavy pouch of gold coins Sterling dropped onto his mahogany desk quickly warmed the magistrate's disposition. By the light of a flickering oil lamp, the backdated marriage certificate was forged and sealed. Abigail Prescott, the starving fugitive of Dead Man's Draw, officially ceased to exist. In her place stood Abigail Montgomery, the wealthiest woman in Blackwood County. The transition was jarring. As the brutal winter raged outside, locking the estate in a sea of white, Abigail recovered in the lap of luxury. She traded her moth-eaten rags for tailored riding habits and warm woolen dresses ordered specifically from Denver. Yet she refused to play the part of a helpless socialite. The first day she was strong enough to walk down the stairs unassisted. She marched straight into Sterling's study and demanded a job. "I am not a porcelain doll, Montgomery," she declared, her hazel eyes flashing with that same wild defiance she had shown in the cabin. "I won't sit by the fire while your men risk their necks guarding this property from Higgins. Put me to work." Sterling, seated behind his massive oak desk, couldn't hide his quiet amusement. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who feared him and women who wanted his money. Abigail wanted neither. She wanted to earn her keep. "Can you ride?" Sterling asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "Better than half your ranch hands," she shot back. "Good. Meet me at the stables at dawn," he replied. That morning marked a shift in their forged alliance. Sterling began taking Abigail on his daily perimeter checks. He showed her the sprawling expanse of ironwood, teaching her the logistics of the cattle trade, the supply lines, and the vulnerable points of the property. In return, Abigail showed him a grit he had never encountered. She rode through freezing sleet without complaint, learned the names of every hand on the ranch, and spent her evenings meticulously reviewing the ledgers of her father's stolen silver claim, plotting a way to get it back. The quiet, unspoken tension between them grew with each passing day. Sterling found his gaze lingering on the curve of her jaw as she studied maps, while Abigail caught herself admiring the broad, strong line of his shoulders when he chopped firewood. The marriage was a legal fiction, but the partnership and the simmering attraction was becoming entirely real. The fragile peace shattered in late February. Wyatt, Sterling's grizzled foreman, burst into the dining room as they were finishing supper. His face was pale, his breathing heavy. "Boss, we got a massive problem," Wyatt said, removing his snow-dusted hat. "Higgins didn't go to the local marshals. He went over our heads. He sold the fraudulent rights of the Prescott claim to an Eastern mining syndicate out of Chicago. They've hired outside muscle." Sterling stood up, his napkin dropping to the floor. "Who did they hire?" "Regulators," Wyatt grimaced. "A private army led by Clayton Briggs. They bypassed Ridgeville entirely and set up camp 3 miles south of our property line. They have a Gatling gun, Sterling, and they have a federal warrant signed by a corrupt judge in Denver, demanding the immediate surrender of Abigail Prescott for grand larceny and murder." Abigail's blood ran cold. Clayton Briggs was a notorious name in the West, a ruthless mercenary who specialized in burning out homesteaders for corporate syndicates. "Higgins is smart," Sterling muttered, pacing the room. "He knows my local influence keeps the county law off my back, so he brought a federal war to my doorstep." "I have to leave," Abigail said, her voice trembling but resolute. She turned to Sterling. "If I run, they'll follow me. They won't attack Ironwood. I won't let your men die for my father's mine." Sterling closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. You are a Montgomery. We do not run. We dig in, and we fight." He turned to Wyatt. "Arm every man on this ranch. Barricade the main gates. Send a rider to Denver, straight to Governor Alva Adams. Tell him Josiah Higgins is using a fraudulent deed to orchestrate a massacre on Ironwood land, and bring the original deed Abigail has. If we can hold them off long enough for the governor to verify the real deed, Higgins and Briggs will be the ones hanging from a rope." "Yes, boss," Wyatt nodded, sprinting out of the room. Sterling looked back at Abigail. The cattle baron's cold, impenetrable facade was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning protectiveness. He reached into his coat and handed her a brand-new Colt Peacemaker. "You said you could shoot," Sterling said softly. Abigail took the heavy revolver, checking the cylinder with expert precision. "I won't miss." The assault began just before dawn. The sky was a bleeding purple when the first shots rang out, shattering the icy silence of the valley. Clayton Briggs and his regulators didn't bother with a parley. They swarmed the southern ridge, pouring a hail of rifle fire down onto the Ironwood stables and bunkhouses. Sterling's men returned fire from fortified positions behind water troughs and reinforced wagon beds. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of black powder and burning pine. Inside the main house, Sterling and Abigail took up positions on the second-floor balcony, providing covering fire. Sterling was a machine, his Winchester rifle barking with deadly accuracy, dropping regulators before they could breach the outer fences. Beside him, Abigail proved her mettle, her steady hands taking down a man trying to set fire to the hayloft. "They have too many men," Abigail shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. "They're trying to pin us down so they can bring up the Gatlin," Sterling yelled back, pointing toward the tree line. Through the smoke, they saw a heavy, horse-drawn cart struggling through the snow. Mounted on the back was a brass-barreled Gatling gun. If they got it within range, they would tear the wooden manor to splinters in minutes. Walking behind the cart, shielded by his hired killers, was Josiah Higgins, a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his sweaty face. "I need to take out those draft horses," Sterling growled, rapidly reloading his rifle. "Cover me." Before Abigail could object, Sterling vaulted over the balcony railing, landing heavily on the snow-covered porch roof below. He slid to the ground, using the stone pillars of the veranda for cover as he sprinted toward the front gates. "Sterling, no!" Abigail screamed, watching as a dozen regulators turned their weapons on him. Bullets chewed the dirt and splintered the wood all around him. Panic and a terrifying realization gripped Abigail's heart. She wasn't just afraid of losing her protector. She was terrified of losing the man she had fallen in love with. Without thinking, she abandoned the balcony, sprinting down the grand staircase and bursting through the kitchen doors. She flanked the eastern side of the property, moving through the dense, snow-laden apple orchard unseen. She emerged just 30 yards from the Gatling gun cart. Sterling was pinned down behind a granite horse trough, taking heavy fire. The regulators were adjusting the crank of the heavy weapon, aiming it directly at his position. Abigail stepped out from the trees. She raised the Colt Peacemaker, taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart. She didn't aim for the mercenaries. She aimed for the wooden spokes of the cart's heavy rear wheel. She fired 3 rapid shots. The heavy lead slugs shattered the brittle, frozen wood. As the cart lurched forward, the wheel collapsed entirely. The heavy brass Gatling gun tipped violently sideways, spilling into the deep snow, its ammunition belt snapping and tangling in the mud. "The gun is down!" one of the regulators shouted in panic. Higgins whipped around, his eyes locking onto Abigail. "There she is! Kill her!" But the distraction was all Sterling needed. He rose from his cover, his revolver clearing its holster in a blinding blur. He fired twice. The first shot disarmed Briggs, shattering the mercenary's shoulder. The second shot took Higgins squarely in the kneecap. The corrupt mining baron screamed, collapsing into the bloody snow. Seeing their leader wounded and their heavy weapon destroyed, the remaining regulators broke rank and fled into the tree line, unwilling to die for a crippled employer. The deafening silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Sterling slowly lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. He turned and saw Abigail standing by the orchard, the smoking Colt still in her hand. He didn't walk. He ran to her. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. The wealthy, untouchable cowboy buried his face in her hair, his hands trembling for the first time in his life. "You foolish, brave woman," Sterling breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have been killed." "I was protecting my husband," Abigail whispered, looking up at him, the truth of her words hanging in the crisp winter air. Sterling looked deep into her hazel eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, a fierce, desperate kiss that tasted of gunpowder and undeniable truth. The forged alliance was dead. The real marriage had just begun. By noon, the rider returned from Denver, accompanied by a contingent of U.S. Marshals under the direct orders of Governor Alva Adams. The original deed had been verified. Josiah Higgins was arrested for fraud, attempted murder, and the assassination of Caleb Prescott. He would spend the rest of his miserable life in a territorial prison. As the marshals hauled a weeping Higgins away in a wagon, Sterling and Abigail stood on the porch of the bullet-scarred Ironwood Manor. Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out the blood-stained deed, handing it back to her. "The silver claim is yours, Abigail. You're a wealthy woman in your own right now," Sterling said, a soft, genuine smile touching his lips. "You don't need a fake marriage to protect you anymore. If you want an annulment, I will grant it." Abigail took the deed, looked at it for a long moment, and then slowly tore it in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter away in the cold mountain breeze. "My father's legacy isn't in the silver," Abigail said, threading her arm through Sterling's. "It's in surviving, and I think I'd rather build a legacy here, as a Montgomery." What began as a desperate standoff in a freezing, ruined cabin blossomed into the most formidable dynasty the West had ever seen. Sterling and Abigail Montgomery ruled Ironwood not just with wealth, but with an unbreakable bond forged in blood and winter ice. Their legendary tale proves that sometimes the most dangerous gambles yield the greatest treasures, and true love can be found in the harshest of frontiers.